lecture, and in the next ones we're going to be discussing the topic of animal communication. In this one in particular, we're going to examine the following issues. First, how do animal communication systems work? And second, we're going to examine whether animal communication systems differ in important respects from human language. And in our discussion today, we're going to focus first of all on the dance language of honeybees. We've mentioned this to some extent already, but we're going to be reviewing as well as adding some complexity to the discussion. And we're also going to discuss the communication system of vervet monkeys. And we're going to see that there are indeed important differences between human language and the communication systems of non-human animals. First of all, what is communication? Communication refers to the transmission of information between two or more individuals through the use of some type of signal that can be responded to reliably by the receiver. So clearly human language works this way, right? A person says something to someone else, the other person understands them and responds accordingly. And non-human animals also work this way. So for example, some monkeys live in groups, and when one spots a predator, they'll make the call that corresponds to that predator, and that call will spread to other group members, and they will all respond accordingly or appropriately given the type of predator that it is. So what kinds of information can be transmitted and communicated by animals? So what do they communicate about? Mostly information that's biologically adaptive. So it includes things like sexual receptivity, emotional states, the presence of food, the presence of predators, and so on. So a nice example of this is chimpanzees. They're not always equally sexually receptive, the females. But when they are maximally sexually receptive, they go into what is called estrus, where they advertise, they signal, they communicate their sexual receptivity by producing a very specific signal. In particular, their sexual organs, their genitals, turn bright red and swollen, and they also emit scents that are attractive to the chimpanzee males. So it's a signal that's produced and responded to reliably by the chimpanzees receiving it. But today I'm going to begin by discussing the dance language of the honeybee, Apis mellifera. And as I said, this will be somewhat of a review, but we will add some more detail and complexity. So the dance language was first decoded, as you recall, by von Frisch in the 1940s. He discovered that bees use a special signal to communicate to other hive members the distance and direction to a food source. So honeybees go out looking for food, and when they find the food and it's desirable, they come back to the hive, and then they perform a dance that tells the other hive members where that food can be found. And they do this by performing the Waggle dance. It has a figure 8 pattern, and the loops of the 8 are made in alternating sequence, and in the center of the figure 8 the bee performs the Waggle run, and it's the Waggle run that actually conveys the crucial information about distance and direction. Right, so the Waggle run involves vibrating the abdominal region from side to side, and as we'll see, the number of waggles in the Waggle run is important, as is the angle at which that Waggle run is done. So other bees can detect important features of the dance by using their antennae, which are sensitive and responsive to frequencies made by the dance. And then once other bees are recruited, if they're recruited, then they go out and find the food and bring it back, and they dance accordingly and recruit yet other bees. Right, so while bees are performing the the waggle run. They're also unloaded by other bees waiting in the hive. And as we've seen before, direction is encoded by the angle of the waggle run relative to the vertical plane of the hive. Right? So if this is the top and bottom line of the hive, the angle that the bee does the dance relative to that line communicates direction. And it communicates direction relative to the position of the sun. So if it's done, say, 45 degrees to the left of the vertical line, the bees will assume that the food is 45 degrees to the left of the sun's projection onto the horizon. So in this figure, you can see on the bottom the waggle run, and you can see that in the center it's done 80 degrees to the right of the vertical, and that conveys, as you can see in the figure, that the food source is 80 degrees to the right of the sun. What about distance? So that's direction, but distance is different, right? Distance is encoded by the number of waggles that the bee performs in the waggle run, right? So the number of waggles in the waggle run. And the relationship, now this is where the complexity comes in, because we've already discussed some of this, but the relationship between waggling and distance depends on the variety of the bee. Different bee populations use a different code. So for example, for German bees, each waggle corresponds to about 50 meters. For Italian bees, each waggle is about 20 meters. And Egyptian bees have a rate of about 1 waggle equals 10 meters. And this seems to be innate, because if you transplant very young bees to different hives, they use their own code from their own hive in order to decode distance. Now the system is very accurate, right? The waggle dance communicates information about food sources very accurately, at least within a certain range. A range of 60 meters all the way up to 15 kilometers, right? It's about 10 miles, right? They can communicate accurately the distance and direction to the food source. Now, some of the complexities that we've already seen, some of the intricacies, as we saw or discussed before, the position of the sun changes throughout the day. Right? So if you're going to communicate distance relative to the sun, you have to take into account the fact that the sun changes position. And the bees adjust for this by changing the angle of the waggle run to correspond with that changing position of the sun. And this is important because otherwise bees would get increasingly inaccurate information as the day proceeds, and they don't. Some more complexity here. Foraging bees don't always dance, right? The likelihood of dancing depends on the quality of the food. So their assessment of food quality takes into account distance, right? So the quality of the food is affected by the distance, right? How much energy they have to expend in order to get the food. So another way of saying that is that a bee may waggle for food of quality X if it's close, but if it's really far away, they may not waggle because it's good, but it's not worth going that far to get it, right? There's better stuff nearby. Likelihood of dancing also depends on the time of day. If they arrive back at the hive late in the day and the food is far, they may not dance at all, right? Because there's not enough time for the bees to go out, get the food, and then come back. So as I said, there's bees that are unloading the bees that are coming in, and the bees that do the unloading are also very discriminating, right? They take into account various factors, right? So the unloading bees, they compare what various bees are bringing in, and they only unload those that have the highest quality food. Even if a forager is waggling feverishly, they'll ignore it if there's better stuff to be had from another bee. And this affects the dancing, right? Because if bees aren't unloaded at a fast enough rate, they eventually stop dancing. And the unloaders also have another important job, right? They also take into account what the hive needs at any given point in time. Right? So if it's very hot, for example, water may be more important than pollen or nectar. So they'll give priority to bees that are bringing back water and indicating water. Now, some more recent research by Ni suggests that bees can also stop others from dancing if they encounter threats or certain unpleasant experiences at the food source. Right? So if a foraging bee finds some nice flowers but is attacked by an insect or a spider or a hostile bee from another hive, right? This could influence what they do when they come back to the hive. So, for example, some spiders have figured out to wait by nectar-bearing flowers in order to ambush bees. Right? So if a foraging bee encounters such negative experiences and they go back to the hive and they detect that a bee is signaling to others to go to that food source, right? The bee will butt with his head, right? The dancing bee. And this gets him to stop dancing. Right, so Ni did some clever experiments on this. There was different food sources, and bees would forage at different food sources. But when they got to one of those food sources, he pinched the leg of a foraging bee. And this was done to simulate kind of an insect bite. And he induced the bees to produce a danger signal back at the hive. But they only produced a danger signal to those bees that were signaling for that specific food source where they had been pinched. Right? So those bees that were signaling to a different food source were not interfered with. And we can see that in this figure. The bee that has the yellow dot of paint is performing the waggle dance for a specific food source, and the bee labeled with an S is the one that was pinched at the food source, and you can see him butting the bee with his head, and that gets this bee to stop dancing because there's something dangerous at that food site. Alright, so although the dance behavior of bees is an innate system of communication, it is far from being a dumb mechanical process, right? It's quite intricate, it's quite subtle, it's adaptive, it's complex, right? So the recruitment dance isn't just an automatic response to food or even to food quality, right? There's a bunch of factors that are taken into account and weighed against one another, and it influences the behavior of the hive as a whole. And this is amazing because all of this information is integrated in a brain that's the size of a sesame seed, right? They can do a lot, especially because they pool their resources as a hive. So, having discussed the dance language of the honeybee, what I want to do is I want to talk about the features of human language to see how human languages and the communication systems of other animals differ, if they differ at all. So a good way to start is by looking at what features does human language have, and then we can ask whether animal communication systems, any of them, have any of these features. So human language possesses many features, including the 4 that I'm going to be discussing. First is the fact that they have discrete arbitrary units. Right? Language is made up of discrete words. Discrete in the sense that the same word can appear in lots of different statements, lots of different types of sentences and questions and so on. Right? So it's made up of discrete units words that are arbitrarily related to the objects and events to which they refer. So for example, the word dog is a discrete unit, and it doesn't resemble in any way the objects that it denotes, right? It doesn't resemble actual dogs. So that's what we mean by arbitrary unit. It's arbitrarily related to what it signifies. A second feature of human language is that it features semanticity. Right? Language is used to transfer or communicate meaning from one individual to another. Right? So the transmitter knows what the signal refers to, and the receiver of the signal also appreciates the meaning of the signal. So if you tell me something about a dog, I'll know what you're talking about. Right? You use the word dog in a way that's similar to the way that I use it. The third very important feature of language is that it features displacement. Right? Language can be used to talk about things not immediately present. We can talk about what happened yesterday. We can talk about the origins of the universe and the Big Bang. We can also talk about what will happen tomorrow, or we can talk about, the eventual heat death of the universe when all energy is distributed evenly. Right? So we can talk about these vast expanses of time, and we're not locked into simply talking about what's going on in our immediate perceptual environment. Fourth, and probably most important, human language features productivity. Right? Language isn't just discrete symbols. Language is also a set of rules for combining those symbols to create well-formed expressions. And the rules are productive because the same rules and the same symbols can be used to create an infinite number of novel expressions. Right? So human language can convey meanings that haven't been conveyed before. So for example, I'm pretty sure no one else has said this sentence before. Well, I could be wrong. The big dog looked great wearing a purple dress and gold earrings. Right? It would be very unlikely that someone before me has put those symbols together in that way to convey this meaning. Now, we've discussed 4 features of human language, and at least some of the animal communication systems seem to have at least some of these features. And this is where I want to turn to a discussion of vervet monkey call systems. So vervet monkeys have evolved a system of calls that allows them to warn each other about the presence of different predators. So they have calls for eagles, they have calls for leopards, they have calls for snakes, and so on. Right? So when they see one of these predators, they emit the appropriate call. When they see a different predator, they emit a different call. Right? So how does this compare to the features possessed by human language? Well, first of all, the vervet communication system possesses discrete units. Right? The call for snake, for example, is different from other calls. And this can be seen in what are called spectrographs. A spectrograph, you don't have to worry too much about this. I just want to get the very basic idea. A spectrograph tells you what frequencies are present in a call and at what intensity. Okay? So all I want you to get from this is that you have a call for leopard, a call for eagle, a call for snake, and physically each of these symbols is distinct. Right? And one bizarre thing is that they're different depending on whether it's a male or a female as well. I'm not sure why that is the case. But the call for snake is different from the call for eagle, which is different from the call for leopard. And the vervet calls are also arbitrarily related to what they refer to. Right? So the call for leopard doesn't look like or sound like a leopard. And it could just as easily have been used to warn about eagles instead. Now the vervet communication system also features semanticity. Right? They convey meaning. Right? And vervets appreciate the meaning of what they hear. How do we know that? because they produce the response that's adaptive for that specific call. Okay, so we know this because they produce adaptive responses in others when a particular call is heard. Right, so for example, when they produce the snake call, right, the other vervet monkeys will rise up and look around. And you can see this response. And you can also see that enormous python that's emerged there. You can see them rising up and looking around. Right, that's not the response that's produced when they hear a call for eagle. Right, if they're in trees, for example, and they hear a call for eagle, they'll evacuate the trees. Okay, so each call leads to a distinct response on the part of the group, and it's an adaptive response. Semanticity is also illustrated by the fact that the infants have to learn to produce the calls, and they have to learn to produce them reliably, right? The right call for the right predator. If an infant or a very young vervet monkey produces the wrong call, the mother will respond appropriately for that call, right? But if she figures out that this was the wrong call, she'll come back to the infant and punish the infant for producing the wrong call, right? So they get chewed out or hit or something. So clearly the mothers are understanding what the signals are supposed to mean, and they're correcting their children for not producing the right meaning. So, given these similarities between the vervet system of communication and humans, are there any important differences? And the answer is yes, right? And the differences mainly have to do with displacement and productivity. Right? Vervets lack displacement, right? They're bound to communicating about things that are taking place around them in the present moment, right? Predators that are there at the present moment. And they also lack productivity, right? They don't have a system of rules for combining their calls to create novel expressions, right? They're single calls produced in isolation to produce a particular effect. They're not combined to create sentences, for example. Right? They're called standalone and are used on their own to convey particular meanings. So, to put it all together for this lecture, the main difference between human and animal communication has to do with productivity and displacement. Right? Animals are largely bound to producing calls about things that are around in their present environment, and they can't combine elements as we can to create novel meanings. Right? So animal communication systems don't have syntax. Now you could argue that the dance language of the honeybee does have some syntax, since there's ways of combining a number of waggles with a particular angle to convey the meaning of a new location for a food source, but it's still rather limited in comparison to human syntax. Right, so even the waggle dance of the bee is limited in the novel meanings that can be conveyed. Right? We can communicate. Our productivity extends into many, many topics, not just about the location of food in certain locations. Alright, so in the next lecture we're going to be discussing whether or not animals can actually be taught some kind of human-like language that has these features of productivity and displacement. And what we'll see is that even when they are taught symbols, they start to feature displacement, but they still don't feature productivity. Right? Animals cannot learn syntax, but we'll get to that next time.